Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I will start with the part that still makes my mouth go dry when I think about it, because it was the exact second I understood that my family could smile in my face while planning something major without me, and they would call it kindness while they did it, which makes it worse than ordinary meanness. I was on my lunch break, scrolling through my cousin's tagged photos, when I saw my mom with a paper crown on her head and my sister with that grin she saves for when she has gotten exactly what she wanted, holding a plastic flute and standing under a banner with the cruise line's logo, and the caption said something like "family time at last," and I knew in one breath that a trip had been booked, that the staterooms had been assigned, that the excursions had been chosen, and that I had been left out on purpose. I called my mom because I wanted to believe there was some sane explanation, something like a surprise I was not supposed to see yet or a reservation glitch that would be fixed in an hour, and my mom, who has a voice that goes small whenever she knows she is doing something she cannot defend, gave me this little speech about how Lacey had really been trying so hard lately and how she needed space from judgment and heavy energy and old patterns. And while she talked, I could feel my chest get tight, not because I was shocked, but because the script was so familiar I could have recited it line by line. The same script I have heard since we were kids, where Lacey is the one who must be protected from cause and effect while I am expected to be the adult who makes room for her choices, and then pays the bill when those choices land like a brick. I kept my voice steady and asked a simple question, which was whether the family vacation was happening without me, and when she said yes, and added that she hoped I would understand and not make it a thing, something in me just slid into place. Like the click of a lock when you finally push the door all the way shut, because I remembered the car payment I had sent just 3 days earlier so Lacey would not lose the vehicle she uses to bounce between jobs she hates and friends she exhausts, and I remembered the utilities that draft out of my account every month for the apartment I own and let her live in, and the grocery money I quietly Venmo to her when she tells me she had a rough week, and I thought, if I am heavy energy, then it is heavy energy that keeps the lights on and the wheels turning, and it suddenly felt crazy to keep underwriting the lifestyle of a person who cannot stand my presence in a deck chair. I told my mom that I heard her and that I loved her and that I would not fight anyone about their vacation, which made her sigh with relief and tell me I was being so mature, and I bit my tongue because I did not want to say something I could not take back. But the truth is I did not feel mature in that moment. I felt tired in a way that went down to the bone, tired of carrying and then being told to walk softer so the person being carried does not notice my arms around them, and after I hung up, I just sat there at my desk and stared at a blank screen and thought about how many times I have been the one who gets called when Lacey blows up a job or a relationship or a bank account. And I realized that the only reason it keeps happening is that I keep catching her before she actually hits the floor. Later that night, she texted me a cheerful photo from the ship with a caption about how she was finally breathing again, and I looked at those words and felt something weirdly calm settle over me, because I knew I was done begging for a seat at a table I helped pay for. And if she wanted space, then I could give her something better than space. I could give her the clear outline of her own life without my hands holding it up, and the part of me that used to worry about looking mean just went quiet, because I had been cast as the villain anyway, and I might as well write my own lines. People will hear this and ask why I did not confront everyone in a big dramatic call, and the reason is simple and not noble, which is that I have tried the calm conversations and the boundary talks and the tearful explanations. And what happens every time is that Lacey cries and someone says she is fragile and I end up apologizing for a tone I did not use. And I was not going to do that dance again, so I did the other thing, the thing that usually scares me because it feels final, which is I opened my laptop, pulled up the accounts, and stared at the list of automatic payments tied to my name and her comfort. And for once I asked myself what would happen if I stopped believing that love means I solve everything before anyone else notices there is a problem. That night I did not sleep much, not because I was spiraling but because I was organizing, which is my default when I am hurt. I thought about the car and the apartment and the way every bill has my name on it, and I wrote down what I pay and why. And under each line, I wrote a question, which was whether this payment is actually helping or if it is just keeping the story going. And by morning, I had a plan that was not loud and not petty, and also not reversible once I set it in motion. And I felt this sharp mix of relief and dread because I knew exactly what would happen when I pulled the first thread. I sent one text to Lacey before I left for work, and it said that I hoped the trip was everything she wanted and that when she got back we would talk about some changes, and she sent back a heart and a line about fresh starts, and I stared at that heart and thought, all right then, let's make this a fresh start for real, because if she needs space from me, I am going to give her more space than she can handle. When I say I made a plan, I do not mean a dramatic manifesto or a spreadsheet with color codes and conditional formulas. I mean I sat down with a cup of coffee that tasted like nothing and opened the loan portal where I have been the quiet ghost payer on my sister's sedan for more months than I want to admit. And I stared at the auto draft switch that I had flipped on the day she cried on my couch and said she just needed a little runway to get her life steady, and I thought about how that runway somehow kept extending like a project that never finishes because someone is always moving the deadline, and I moved the cursor and turned the draft off, then confirmed it, then checked again because I have that habit of second-guessing myself when I finally do something for me, and once it was done I sat perfectly still and waited for guilt to come roaring in with sirens, only it did not. It just arrived in these little waves that felt more like the crash after a long sprint than a moral crisis. I did not announce it, because I am done announcing things to people who hear a boundary as an invitation to argue. And I did not leave a warning because warnings in my family translate into negotiation periods where everyone pretends to be reasonable while they are actually bullying you with sweetness, so I let the calendar do the work. And when the draft date passed without money moving, nothing happened in the sky and nothing collapsed on the ground, which told me something I wish I had learned years ago, which is that not every fire is mine to put out, and if it gets hot, the person who built the bonfire can figure out what to do with it. The call from Lacey came a few weeks later, sunny mid-morning, that voice she saves for customer service fights, where she is sure she can charm and threaten at the same time, telling me that something must be wrong with the bank because the loan company was being dramatic and sending messages about delinquency, and I kept my tone soft and said I would take a look, and I did the thing I have learned to do when I am being manipulated, which is buy myself time, so I told her I was in the middle of something and would check my side after lunch, and I swear I could hear her blink because she expected me to jump, not stroll, and the silence tasted better than my coffee. Here is the part where people usually ask if I felt cruel, and I will tell you what I actually felt, which was the weight of a responsibility I should never have accepted moving off my chest inch by inch. Because I remembered the day I signed as the payer when the dealer said they could not do anything without someone with better credit, and I remembered telling myself it was a bridge, not a marriage, and then watching it become a lifestyle where I was the invisible engine and she was the driver who never thought about gas, and when you become the engine you stop being a person in someone else's head, which is why you can be left off a family cruise and still be expected to keep the car rolling. The bank did its bank thing, late fees, firm notices, those warning emails that sound like a school principal pretending to be polite, and I kept my hands in my lap. Because part of me was curious what my sister would do when faced with a problem I did not sprint to fix, and the answer turned out to be exactly what you think, which is that she ignored it until ignoring was no longer an option. And the tow truck showed up early one weekday outside her building with that quiet efficiency that makes you understand there is no speech you can give that will undo logistics, and she called me then with a sound I recognized from childhood, not sadness, but outrage that the world was not bending around her needs. And she said my name like it was a warning and asked if I had done this to her, as if I had personally hooked the chains to the axle. I told her the truth, which was that I had stopped paying for her car, that I had been covering those payments for longer than any fair person would expect, that I wished her well and believed she could handle her own transportation like every adult we know, and that I was not interested in arguing about tone or timing, and she went through the stages, the soft plead, the nostalgia how we are sisters and family means support, the attack about how I always make everything transactional, the pivot to calling me controlling, which is funny if you think about who was actually steering this situation all along, and I listened because I have learned that interrupting only feeds the beast. And then I told her I hoped she got where she needed to go and ended the call before she wound up for another lap. The family chat lit up within an hour, as predictable as the sunrise, with my aunt doing her peace ambassador routine and my mother trying to fold me back into the role of the flexible older sister who makes allowances for the more sensitive one. And the lines were all the classics, that Lacey was having a rough patch, that a car is about safety and not luxury, that perhaps we could revisit an arrangement for a few months to get her through, and I wrote one careful message that said I would no longer be financing my sister's life while being excluded from family events on the premise that my existence is stressful, and that I love them, and that this was not a conversation about kindness. It was a conversation about boundaries I should have set when we were teenagers, and then I muted the thread because I am done donating my nervous system to other people's emergencies. If you are wondering whether I cried, the answer is no and yes, because I did not cry about the car. I cried later that night in the shower when I thought about how many times I have swallowed my own needs to make sure my sister never had to face hers. And the tears were not grief. They were this mix of anger and relief that washed through me like I was rinsing off a decade of being everybody's insurance policy. And when I stepped out, I felt empty in a clean way, like I finally had room to think about what my life could look like if I stopped treating chaos like a job description. Of course, Lacey posted some half-truth on social about people showing their true colors, which is her favorite way to recruit sympathy without explaining facts. And a couple of her friends sent me sharp little messages that I ignored because I am no longer taking feedback from people who think consequences are abusive, and in the quiet that followed I realized something almost funny, which is that for the first time in years my phone was not buzzing with requests from her for rides or gas money or bridge loans. It was buzzing with silence, and silence, when you are used to being needed for the wrong reasons, feels like oxygen. I slept that night, real sleep, the kind where your body believes you are safe, and woke up with a calm that told me I was not done, because the car was only the first artery I had to close if I wanted the bleeding to stop. And while I brushed my teeth, I thought about the other place where my name was carrying her comfort, the apartment where every bill, every line, and every right belonged to me, and I smiled in a way that would have scared me a month ago, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I was finally ready to stop hurting myself. So I picked up my phone and opened the Utilities app, and I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I woke up the next morning with that same steady calm that feels almost dangerous, because it is not adrenaline and it is not rage. It is the kind of quiet that shows up when a decision has been made and your body is finally on board. And I took my coffee to the kitchen counter, opened the apps that keep my sister comfortable, and stared at the list of services that run like invisible servants in the background of her life. And I thought about how every time I have tried to talk about responsibility with her, I end up in a debate about tone while the lights I pay for keep glowing behind the argument. So I decided to stop debating tone and start speaking in the only language that ever gets through to people who use excuses like shields. And that language is cause and effect written directly on a bill. I started with the power because that is the heartbeat of a modern life, and I will admit I hesitated for a long minute. Not because I doubted the choice, but because I knew the fallout would be noisy, and I have always hated noise. Yet there I was, tapping the option to discontinue service at the end of the current cycle, and the system asked me to confirm and asked for a reason, and gave me a sterile list like moving or non-payment, and I picked owner's decision because it was the first time in years I had said those words to myself without apology. And once that went through, I did the same with the water and the internet, and by the time I closed the last tab, my hands were not shaking, which surprised me. They were still. And the stillness told me that I was not acting out of spite. I was finally letting reality catch up to a situation I had been propping up with good intentions that nobody respected. I did not warn her because warnings become theater in my family, the kind where everyone performs concern while quietly coordinating around the person who is about to lose their favorite convenience, and I was done being used as a soft landing. So I let the calendar breathe, and a few days later she called from a friend's place sounding equal parts wounded and irritated, telling me that her power had been cut and asking whether I had paid the bill because she was sure this was some billing error, and I said with the politeness I reserve for strangers that there was no error, that I had made a choice about the apartment I own and finance, and that it was time for her to take full control of her life. And there was a pause where I could hear her assembling a strategy, and then she said the line that always shows up, which is that family does not do this to family, and I said the line I had been too scared to say for years, which is that family also does not exclude the person keeping the lights on from a trip under the headline of needing space. She hung up with that abrupt little click she uses when she wants to punish me with silence, and then the silence broke with a flood of messages that tried on every costume. There was the pleading costume about mental health and fresh starts. There was the indignant costume about cruelty and control. There was the public relations costume on social media painting a vague picture of betrayal without a single specific, and I let all of it float past because I have learned that engaging with a costume only encourages the performance, and the only thing I sent to the family chat was a short note saying I was making changes to arrangements that never should have been permanent, and that I would not be discussing it further. Which of course triggered a new wave of speeches about kindness and patience, and I muted it again because I am not a committee. The practical consequences came in fast, the way consequences do when the scaffolding is removed, and I started hearing through the grapevine that she was showering at a friend's place and charging her phone in the car before the car went away. And part of me felt this ache because I am not made of stone, but a louder part said that if she can organize an entire cruise to celebrate her need for space, she can organize a payment plan or a new roommate or a job that lasts more than a season. And when she called again late one night, not crying but furious in that righteous way that has always made people scramble to fix things for her, I listened until she ran out of steam and then told her something I do not think she had ever really believed, which is that the apartment is mine, not metaphorically mine, not older sister mine, but legally and fully mine, and that I had allowed her to live there under a handshake agreement because I trusted that we both understood the difference between generosity and obligation. She tried to tell me I could not just pull services on a tenant, and I calmly reminded her she is not a tenant. She is a sister who was given an arrangement that she turned into a lifestyle. And I said that we could formalize it like adults with a lease and her paying the bills in her own name, or we could go the other route, and the silence on the line stretched until I thought the call had dropped, and then she said she would call Mom and fix this, as if my mother runs the utility company. And I said quietly that Mom cannot help here, because this is between me and the property I own, and I ended the call by telling her that I would be sending something in writing so there was no confusion, which she pretended not to hear because paperwork is where her confidence evaporates. The next morning I printed the forms I needed, not because I take pleasure in paperwork, but because I have learned that clarity is mercy, and if I was going to draw a line then I would draw it in ink, with dates and signatures and options she could choose if she wanted to live like a grown woman. And while the printer hummed, I thought about every time I have been told to keep the peace, and how peace has always meant I carry more than my share and keep quiet about it. And I realized I am done with that definition. I want the version of peace where I sleep through the night without rehearsing answers to accusations I do not deserve, and that version starts with a notice placed in an envelope and a timeline nobody can pretend they did not understand. I walked the envelope to her door at midday because I wanted daylight for the delivery and also because I knew she would not be home, and I slid it under the frame and took a photo for my records. Not because I am vengeful, but because I am finally careful with myself, and on the way back to my car I could feel that same dangerous calm again, only now it felt less like quiet and more like momentum, because cutting the power was never the endgame. It was only the nudge toward reality, and the next step was the part that would separate the past from the future with a clean line, the step I should have taken when she first turned my help into a habit, which is the one word nobody in my family wants to hear because it sounds like the end of the party. And that word is eviction. I knew the word would land like a slap because in my family we treat boundaries like personal attacks, yet I also knew that if I kept letting fear of a reaction dictate my choices, I would be back to paying for a life that shut me out whenever it wanted a drama break. So I filled out the notice with the same care I use when I sign something at work that actually matters. I listed the dates and the options and the conditions, and I kept the language so plain that even the most creative interpreter could not pretend they did not understand that the free ride was over, and when I dropped that envelope and took the photo for my record, it felt less like a fight and more like finally labeling a box correctly after years of shoving random things into it and hoping it would stack. The first responses came not from Lacey but from the chorus, because nothing brings out the family choir like paperwork, and my mother called with that voice that makes me want to be 6 years old and promise to behave, asking if I had really done something so drastic and whether there was any chance I would consider pausing the entire situation until after the holidays so everyone could breathe, and I had to say the line I have been practicing in the mirror, which is that breathing is exactly what I am finally doing, and that the drama here is not the paper I filed, but the years I spent paying bills that did not belong to me while being treated like a problem to be managed. And she started to cry in that tired way that tells me she is not really sad about me, but about the work she will have to do now that I am out of the way. And I kept my voice steady and said I loved her, and that I was not going to discuss reversing anything, because the only thing worse than never setting a boundary is setting it and then snatching it back the minute someone pouts. Then Lacey called, late and loud, and she went through the greatest hits so fast it almost made me laugh. She said I was cruel and calculating and jealous. She said I could not do this without giving her more time because she was in a delicate place emotionally. She said she had told the building manager that I was harassing her, which is funny in a bleak way because there is no building manager in a duplex I own, and when she ran out of steam, I told her I had given her years and that time was the one thing she never used for anything but excuses, and she tried to pivot to that line about family being forever, and I said that family is not the issue here, entitlement is. And then I told her something I had not said out loud because saying it meant I could not take it back, which is that I would be moving forward with the legal steps if she did not choose the adult option and sign a lease with utilities in her name or vacate by the date on the paper. The group chat went into emergency session like it always does. There were cousins I have not seen in years giving me moral lectures in paragraphs. There were aunts telling me that this would haunt me when we gathered for future birthdays. There were neighbors of my mother weighing in with soothing proverbs that have never paid a single bill, and I let them talk to the void because I am done auditioning for the role of soft heart with deep pockets, and when my dad finally called, quiet and direct as always, he asked me 2 questions, whether I was sure and whether I had thought through the fallout, and when I told him yes to both, he let out a slow breath and said he was proud of me for finally choosing myself, which made me sit down on the edge of the bed and stare at the wall because hearing those words from the one person who never takes sides felt like someone had just handed me my spine back. What really cracked the facade, though, was not the notice or the logistics. It was the truth that slipped out when I got my mother on the phone and asked her a plain question, which was whether the cruise had really been about Lacey needing space. And my mother tried the usual soft shoe dance and then gave up and admitted that Lacey had said I tend to make events about myself with my opinions and my directness, and that having me there would be too much for her nerves while she was focusing on healing, and for a second I could not find my words, not because it hurt in a new way, but because it clarified everything I needed to know about the warped mirror we had all been peering into, since apparently paying for her life in the dark had been fine, but showing up in person with boundaries would have been too much attention. I told my mother I appreciated the honesty, thanked her for finally saying it out loud, and said that given this new clarity I was moving forward without another debate, which is when she leaned hard on the guilt lever and asked how I would feel if something terrible happened to my sister while she was under stress, and I had to say the sentence I never wanted to say, which is that my sister has been under stress for as long as she has had access to excuses, and that protecting her from consequences has not saved her from anything, it has only trained her to outsource responsibility, and that I refuse to keep participating in that training. The formal response deadline came and went without a signature, which told me exactly where we stood, and I took the next step, not gleefully but with the kind of cold focus you get when you finally stop trying to be liked and start trying to be clear. And I filed the papers that move a situation from family drama into an actual process with dates and a finish line, and when Lacey realized I had not been bluffing, she switched tactics and tried to bargain. offering half promises and a payment plan that relied on money that has never arrived on time, and I told her those options were available weeks earlier and that now we were past talk, and she said she would never forgive me, which is a sentence that used to terrify me and now sounded like a relief, because it means I do not have to keep applying for a forgiveness that is always conditional on me funding her comfort. Here is the part one have not said yet, and it will sound colder than it is, but it is the truth that pushed me from boundary to finish, which is that while everyone was yelling about loyalty and optics, I was already talking to a realtor I trust, because I had started to understand that as long as that apartment existed with my name on it, it would be a magnet for the same old mess. And I am too old and too tired to keep walking past the same magnet pretending it will not pull, so I set a quiet meeting to explore options that would make the whole question moot forever, and I did not tell a soul because I wanted one part of this to be free of commentary. When I sealed that plan in my head, I felt that dangerous calm deepen into something like resolve, not vindictive and not cruel, just the kind of steady that happens when you can finally see the last move on the board and you know you are willing to make it. And that is why, when my sister left another raging voicemail and my mother sent a long text about family unity, I set the phone face down and looked at the calendar with the hearing date circled, and I thought about what it would mean to step out of this loop completely, and I told myself the truth in a voice I could not ignore, which is that I was not done, not yet. Because there was one more step that would end the argument for good and make sure nobody could drag me back into this cycle with another crisis, and I was ready to take it. By the time the hearing date crept close and the messages from my sister had turned into a kind of background noise that I refused to let shape my day, I had already made the decision that would end the loop for good. Because I had finally accepted that as long as that apartment sat there with my name on the deed and her name on the mailbox, I would be one guilt trip away from another arrangement and one apology away from reopening the money hose. So I met the realtor in the quietest way possible, walked through the place with a face that gave nothing away, and listened to numbers and timelines while my phone buzzed with fresh declarations about loyalty and blood, and when we stepped outside, I told him to list it immediately, no fanfare, no hints to anyone, and to prioritize a buyer who actually needed a clean start rather than a bargain hunter who would turn it into a cash machine. The offer came faster than I expected from a young couple who arrived with organized folders and a baby who did not cry once, and while I am not a softie about these things and I know everything is business, I felt a kind of quiet alignment because they were exactly the opposite of what had been happening inside those walls. They were building something instead of extracting. They were trying to stand on their own feet instead of leaning until somebody else fell over. And I said yes without blinking, and then I called my attorney and had him handle the formalities so I did not have to stand in front of my sister and watch her face while I said out loud what I had already said to myself, which is that the apartment was never a promise. It was a gift with an expiration date that passed years ago without me noticing. When the sale cleared and the funds landed, the silence inside my head was so complete that I knew I had done the right thing, because there was no thrill and no gloating and no appetite for a victory lap. Only the feeling you get when you finally finish a task that hung over you for too long and you can breathe without accounting for anyone else's panic. And it was in that clean space that the last idea clicked into place. Not an impulse, not a stunt. Just a correction that felt precise and deserved, which was to book a trip for myself and my father on the same cruise line that had happily hosted a family vacation where I was recast as a problem to be excluded, and to choose a cabin like the one in those photos that kicked this whole thing off, and to pay for it with money I used to pour into an endless pit while being told to be gentle and patient. I told my father first, because he is the only person in this story who has not spoken to me like I am a vending machine for solutions. And when I said I wanted to take him away for a week where our phones would live in a drawer and nobody would be able to deputize us into their emergencies, he was quiet in that way he gets when he is trying not to let emotion leak into his voice. And then he said he would go wherever I wanted, and I could hear the relief in that permission because he has been the referee for too long and he is tired of whistles, and I said good, because I had already booked it and the dates were set and we were going to eat on our schedule and sit where we wanted and sleep without anyone banging on the door asking for a wire transfer. The day I told my mother about the sale and the trip, she cycled through disbelief and anger, and then landed on that damp sadness that used to hook me, asking how I could do something so permanent when we had not yet healed the rift, and I reminded her, carefully and without heat, that a rift is not healed by the person who keeps getting cut, that what I had done was not punishment, it was closing an account that should never have been opened in the first place, and that if there was to be healing, it would not come from me reactivating a utility bill, it would come from my sister learning to meet life without turning me into a donor whenever things felt heavy, and my mother accused me of enjoying the drama. And I said the truth that finally shut the conversation down, which is that I did all of this so there would be less drama, not more, and that if she wanted less drama too, she would stop calling me every time Lacey performed a crisis. Lacey did not accept the eviction until the very last hour, because of course she did not, and then there was a blur of boxes and a last voicemail where she tried to sound dangerous by telling me people would see who I really am. And I listened to it exactly once and saved it, not because I needed to hold evidence, but because it is the perfect reminder of how far gone this dynamic was, and then I blocked her number. And when my phone lit up from a new number with the exact same phrases, I blocked that one too, and when a friend of hers attempted a drive-by scolding through social media, I turned off comments and reminded myself that I am not a public utility. The closing happened, the keys changed hands, the couple sent a polite thank you through the realtor, my father packed a small bag with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of business travel, and I printed the boarding confirmations that I will never post. Not because I am hiding, but because I do not need to win on a scoreboard to know I won. And when we walked up the gangway and the staff offered us welcome drinks, I thought about those photos that started all of this and how they had made my throat go dry, and I realized I did not feel thirsty anymore. I felt settled, because I had taken every single lever that used to move me against my will, and I had removed them from the wall. You can call it revenge if you want, and maybe it is, but to me it feels like finally agreeing with myself about what I will and will not be responsible for. And if there is a sting in it for my sister, then that sting belongs to the years she spent avoiding the simple math that grown people have to do, and I am not going to apologize for refusing to carry a calculator for her forever. And if she ever decides to talk like an adult about repairing something real, there is a version of me that might meet her halfway, but it will not be the version that funds her life while being told to stay home for the sake of the mood. It will be the version that sat across from my father on a quiet deck and laughed at a story we have told a dozen times. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop performing the part you were assigned and walk off stage with your dignity. And if that looks like a final move, that is because it is, and it was clean, and it was smart, and it worked.